everyone. Welcome to today's nonpartisan Independent Restaurant Coalition call. We are thrilled to have you join us today as we unpack some of the results of the election, what that means for bars and restaurants, and all of our industry. My name is Ivy Mix. I am a co-host here with Kumar. I was one of the first people in the IRC when we first started during the pandemic. I was on the first advisory board. My role was mostly fighting for bars within the bar and restaurant world in which we live. I own a few different establishments in Brooklyn, New York. I'm in one of them right now, Whoopsie Daisy, a wine bar I opened earlier this year. And I'm really excited to be back in with the IRC and involved in all the amazing work that we're doing. So I'm looking forward to today.
Thanks, Ivy. I'm Cheetie. Some of you might know me. I'm a board member here at the IRC, also been a member since April of 2020. And today's conversation is going to be hopefully very insightful, and we'll talk through the election's impact on our work and the issues affecting independent restaurants and bars and our employees. We're excited to have two very valuable, incredible experts with us today, Patrick Robertson from Confluence Government Relations and Chris Lamond from Thorn Run Partners. Patrick and Chris have been absolutely instrumental in guiding the IRC's advocacy work since our creation in March of 2020. And today they'll share insights into what's next.
Oh, sorry, I had a delivery, so we all know what that's like. Let's dive in. Patrick, can you start by explaining a little bit how the election results impact the bills that are currently in Congress and that affect us, and what's happening as we move into 2025?
Sure. Thanks, Ivy. Thanks, Cheetie. And thanks all of you for having me. As Cheetie noted, I'm the principal at Confluence Government Relations. As you look around, this is it. This is the brain trust of Confluence. So there's not much more to it but me. But I'm thrilled to be here and always happy to work with Chris as well. As you all know by now, obviously the Senate is going to change from Democratic to Republican control on January 3rd. The House is going to remain in Republican control. And then President-elect Trump will be sworn into office on January 20th. And I want to take the question that Ivy asked because I think it's super important. And what she said was, how do the election results impact the bills that we have, right? And the answer is, it actually has nothing to do with the election results, right? And that's kind of the interesting thing about what's going on right now. When they swear in a new Congress in early January, the 118th Congress, which stretches from 2023 through 2024, will end. And sort of all the bills that have been part of that 118th Congress that haven't passed, or that have gotten part of the way down the road but haven't been completed, or whatever the issue is, all of those bills will just go away. I mean, I guess they'll technically go to the archives, right? But they're done. And then in the 119th Congress, which will start when everybody's sworn in on January 3rd, everybody starts over. So no matter what you care about, if you care about war in the Middle East, or cattle tariffs from Australia, or what it takes to make microchips, if your bill didn't get done by the time they leave, you have to start over in the new Congress. Now, the good part about some of those efforts is you don't totally have to start over, right? Your champions are still in Congress, you've got the language, you've built a group of co-sponsors, and you can sort of copy and paste with a few changes depending on who's in and out of Congress. But that happens every 2 years, right? That's sort of the rhythm of DC and how the congressional program works. So let me just sort of take a step back and think about where we are and where we're headed, right? The IRC's been around a number of years. Cheetie and Ivy and a lot of you have been here the whole time. And we've seen the IRC sort of evolve through issues, right? There was I think in the grand scheme of history, a relatively short-lived pandemic that felt like it lasted 185 years, but one that, stretched sort of 2 Congresses, give or take, right? There are people who have been working on issues in Congress for 10 or 15 or 20 years, right? And part of the beauty of those issues is you build momentum each Congress and you maybe change champions or move back and forth. And we have some of those opportunities going into the next Congress. But we also have a lot of people in Congress who know a lot about independent restaurants, right? Whether that's Roger Wicker in the Senate or Brian Fitzpatrick in the House. We're losing our good friend Earl Blumenauer, who's retiring, but Debbie Dingell spent a ton of time with us. I mean, it is a really interesting way to think about the sort of natural rhythm of Congress, to look at our friends and who they are and how they change and what they're doing. So that's sort of my, I don't know, 2 to 3 minute overview of where we are. And Cheetie, I'll give the microphone back to you in the short term.
Thank you. Chris, is there anything you want to add to Patrick's overview, specifically how IRC members should be thinking about engaging coming up in the next year?
Yeah, thanks, Cheetie. I think the biggest impact of the election was that one party will now control everything in Washington. And that really matters. You know, we are about to enter a 2-year period in which the Republicans will control the House, the Senate, and the White House. And that means that they can dramatically ramp up the legislative action that occurs and originates in Congress and then moves on through to the presidency. And if you think about major pieces of legislation that have passed in Congress, you can point to the periods of time where one party had all three in control. You can go back to the Obama administration, the first 2 years of his years of the presidency. They passed 2 major pieces of legislation: the Affordable Care Act, which obviously changed a lot of the healthcare policy in the United States, and then Dodd-Frank, which changed a lot of the banking rules and has still had an impact. Both laws have had dramatic impacts on both sectors. You can look at the first 2 years of the Trump administration, which had all three. They were able to pass the first Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the 2017 tax cuts, which will most likely be the first legislative item out of the gate in 2025, which is reviving those cuts or extending those tax cuts into a period beyond 2025. And then you look at the Biden administration, who the first 2 years of their term, they were able to get the Inflation Reduction Act passed, the climate bill that was influential for the administration, as well as the American Rescue Plan, which had a lot of infrastructure spending. So now is a really important time to stay engaged because a lot's going to happen, and it's up to us to make sure that our priorities are presented to the new Congress and the new leadership the similar ways we've done it in the past, and we've been effective in the past, and I expect us to be successful in the future as well. But no matter who's in charge, when we have all three holding, we only have one party holding all three sides. It's a period of dramatic policy movement.
So speaking of those issues, can we move on to some of the specifics that especially like some of the things we've been hearing from our members? Patrick and Chris, we want to ask you to unpack some of these issues that we've been hearing from our members, just to help us understand what's at stake and what's likely to come next. First off, of these issues that we've been hearing is childcare, and we'd like to kind of have you guys walk us through any changes or what to foresee in that category.
Sure. Thanks, Ivy. I'll take childcare. I think maybe I'll leave the harder ones to Chris, so that'll be easy. Look, a wise restaurateur from Milwaukee once said, "I don't even like children, but I need childcare to run my business." Right? I have children. I happen to like mine and a lot of others. Right? But the like entrepreneurial cost of childcare and the commercial cost of childcare is something that sort of, it's like having a building, right? It's like having employees at this point. And it's something that's pervasive across the economy. At the same time, restaurants are uniquely situated. Like, if you're open till 10 o'clock for dinner service and childcare closes at 6, well, that's a lot of time without childcare. Or, if you have, let's say, 2 parents and one works on this side of town and one works on that side of town, having childcare at each business doesn't help. Like, they need childcare where they need it. And there's reams of studies out there about childcare is not accessible, it is not affordable, and it is not attainable for so much of the workforce. And the IRC has partnered over the last year or two with a group called the First 5 Years Fund. And it's a group that cares about kids 0 to 5. I'm not totally sure what happens when you turn 6. Like, I think maybe they just assume you go to school. I don't know why it cuts off at 5, but they have been super thoughtful and really out front about how to handle childcare, right? And so there are really, frankly, very liberal groups out there who say that the only way to fix childcare is to spend $2 trillion federal dollars, right? And there are really conservative groups out there who say the only way to fix childcare is to pay businesses to create childcare. And one of the things that's been super useful about our partnership with FFYF is they have taken a really all of the above view of childcare, right? So there's the CCDBG program, which is a state block grant program that gives out money to childcare centers. They support funding for that. There are 3 or 4 different tax incentives, including the CDCTC, the Child Development and Child Care Tax Credit, and the DCAP, which gives you healthcare FSAs, and 45F, which encourages you to build childcare. And they look at ways to fund apprenticeship programs to get more workers in the childcare sector. And so it's an interesting sort of marriage of the IRC, which is really uniquely situated in the economy, and this FFYF group that has a lot of ideas to try to do everything that they can to increase investments and access to childcare. And, you know, it's funny, Chris mentioned those sort of times of reconciliation throughout the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration. And you really can look back at the Trump administration as like 2 different presidencies, right? Like the pre-COVID and the post-COVID presidency. They had sort of 2 different things. And I was looking back at some of the childcare stuff. And in 2019, they hosted a really significant childcare roundtable that talked about all the things they wanted to do on childcare. Some of which got done eventually in that Biden reconciliation package, some of which it didn't. But, you know, the Trump administration in 2019 was looking at ways to get access to childcare so people could go work in restaurants and everywhere else. And we very well may see a refocusing on that from the administration. I know we have a ton of people in Congress who care about it. So it's first in this list, not because it's the most important or the easiest, but it is both really important and may turn out to be a place where folks find common ground, but may also be a place where Republicans can sort of focus and run through and get some things done on childcare. So, it's a complicated issue, and unlike other issues where, nobody's making commercials about here are the 14 federal programs on childcare that we can invest in, as opposed to build a wall, right? Like, it's a much simpler message, but it is something where I think a solution is both possible and maybe even likely in the new Congress with the new makeup.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, speaking of things I feel like probably most people can get along with or agree with, are our credit card competition and the impact of swipe fees on small businesses. I know that I'm very, very aware of that. What do we see happening there?
Yeah, I'll take that, Ivy. Thanks. We've seen a lot of action around the Credit Card Competition Act. It's an issue that the IRC has been engaged in from the beginning. It's been a top priority of the coalition for a long time now, and one we've been at the table advocating in support of since the beginning of this legislative fight. It's a bipartisan bill that, for those who are maybe not as familiar with it, a bipartisan bill that seeks to address the interchange fee issue that merchants and consumers alike pay on every transaction that's processed through your point of sale system. The bill has a great amount of support. A lot of organizations like ours are up on the Hill constantly advocating, as we are, in support of this to get it passed. And the advocacy is paying off. We are certainly seeing more and more support build every month for the Credit Card Competition Act. The challenge has been getting that support moved to a position of having the House or Senate bring it up for an actual vote. It seems pretty clear that it would pass if it did come up as a standalone measure, but there are a number of opponents that are in a position to stop it, unfortunately. But we're breaking through that dam, and you know, the champions of the bill, most notably Senator Durbin from Illinois, who just yesterday had a hearing in the Senate as an attempt to continue the momentum of the issue and present it in a way that keeps it in the news, keeps it front and center for the House and Senate leadership, so that they realize that they're not going away. They're going to continue to fight for it and try to find that eventual vehicle that will move through Congress and attach it to. It's important to note that we submitted testimony as part of that hearing. Our own Kevin Boehm submitted testimony on behalf of the IRC, which talked about the importance of this bill and what it would do for independent restaurants and why it's important, what the impact of this legislation would have on our businesses. So we are still engaged. We stay committed to working with Durbin and Senator Marshall from Kansas, who's the other champion on the Republican side, to advance this legislation. It's an issue where members have wanted us to be involved because we are a great, easily understood industry that is impacted by this issue. So we're going to continue to advocate for this as others are. You know, it most likely will not pass before the end of this year, but you know, efforts of the champions will continue throughout the beginning of the next year. We will have it as our priority and work to get the new Congress engaged on it as quickly as we can.
That's very encouraging. Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Another question for you. A pressing issue is restaurant reservation piracy. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, this is a good example, I think, of how the IRC can be nimble and react very quickly to issues that flare up and affect our membership. This issue wasn't a priority of ours when the Congress started 2 years ago. It wasn't on our list of issues, but it obviously became an issue for some of our members who identified this as an area of concern. We also kind of watched what states have done in this area to cut back on reservation piracy. I know there was a very good article in Eater this week or coming up soon that the IRC is mentioned in as a player in this issue. So we got a bill introduced in Congress. I was actually kind of surprised how fast it took. Quickly, we were able to get a bill introduced. Our bill mirrored the state of New York and what they did to cut back on piracy and the inability or prohibiting the sale of reservations at restaurants. We got a bill that was introduced by two members of the House, a bipartisan group of Congressman Anthony Desposito from Long Island and Congressman Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey. This bill will not pass this year, but we'll have to reintroduce it next Congress. We just introduced it, I think, maybe September or early October. So it was a late entry into this Congress, but it's one that we will work towards building support for and try to get it moved as part of the legislative efforts that will happen next year. So we'll also have to get a new champion. Congressman Desposito actually lost his seat, but we've already talked to his staff who are actually moving on to other members' offices and have already started the process of getting another Republican champion for that bill. So again, an example of how we were able to respond to an issue that came up. And I think an example of how we're able to kind of react quicker than maybe most in terms of responding to the needs of our membership.
That's great. I'm looking forward to see who the new champion is going to be. Another big topic, service charges. Patrick, what are we expecting on that front with both Congress and the FTC's pending ruling on junk fees?
Sure. You know, just for 30 seconds of background, the FTC put out a document on what it labels junk fees. And everyone was like, yeah, we're getting rid of junk fees. And then they read the document and it was like, all additional charges at restaurants are junk fees, right? And we all know that that's not true, right? That well disclosed, well thought out, well discussed fees are just that. They're fees. They're not junk fees. They're not added at the end. They're not surprise fees, right? They're part of running a business in a different way to compensate employees and figure out how to run a business. So the IRC wrote a letter to the FTC saying, you got to be kidding us, right? And the FTC has not finalized its rule, frankly, on junk fees. And I don't expect, now that the Biden administration is on its way out, that it will finalize those rules. If it does, the new Congress, it would be subject to a Congressional Review Act where they could repeal the rules. There are not going to be many rules finalized that are subject to review in December because there's not a whole lot of point unless, frankly, you discuss it with congressional Republican allies, right? That's just sort of the way this goes. We could be surprised, but I think the general consensus in DC is that those rules are probably not going to see the light of day. At the same time, we had what Erica has referred to, or who Erica has referred to as the patron saint of restaurants, Congressman Earl Blumenauer, who we mentioned earlier, who's retiring. He introduced a bill to tax service fees, service charges, just like tips. Like we talked about at the beginning of the call, that bill will magically transport itself to the National Archives in January, and we'll need to reintroduce that bill, but Earl Blumenauer won't be here to introduce it for us. So we've had conversations with a couple of Democratic offices about potentially being the lead sponsor on that bill. We've had a conversation with a couple of Republicans as well, and we're hoping that we'll bring that bill back, talk about it in the tax debate, whether it's germane and able to get in there or not, sort of an open question, but it'll be part of the conversation going forward. And then we'll kind of be able to go from there on what happens next. But, you know, that serves two purposes. One, obviously, taxing service fees like tips would allow people to make the change without a federal income tax penalty. But talking about service charges as if they're a normal part of doing business also starts to pull them out of that junk fee bucket, right? And make them more acceptable. So it does sort of have a two-pronged approach.
Awesome. Well, on topic of service charges and tips, during the election, both candidates were discussing making tips untaxable for people who receive tips as part of their income. Is this something that we can realistically anticipate seeing in the upcoming tax package?
I'll take that. I'm anxious to see how this debate unfolds through tax reform. Both candidates actually kind of picked up on the thread of not taxing tips. The realities of the process in which they're going to undertake to renew the 2017 TCJA tax cuts that I mentioned, which are the corporate and individual tax rates. That's a $4.5 trillion price tag. And it is expected that a lot of the debate will be around, well, how much do they cover and pay for versus increase the deficit spending and add to the debt. So when you do that, when you have conversations about how expensive a package would be, certain things tend to fall off. And I think it would be an incredible price tag to remove taxation from tips. So I'm fearful that as a result of how much it will cost the Treasury to basically lose the revenue that would come in from taxing tips, that it will make it too expensive to actually enact. But I think it will be part of the conversation. There will be members, and I'm sure the president will want to have it under consideration. We've heard from members of the House Ways and Means Committee already on the Republican side that have basically said the same thing, that it might be too expensive to include, especially when they want to really focus on the individual and corporate rates, extending those, and some of the other tax provisions that were passed in 2017. So I want to manage expectations a little bit. I'm not quite sure it will become law, but it will be important for us to remain engaged in the conversation. And we are working to find out as much as we can and figure out where members are on this issue, because it's important to stay on top of. But I'm fearful that it will fall away once they start to put that whole package together.
And I'll just jump in for 1 second to say the one place that I think the IRC can play a role in that debate as it comes up, if it comes up, is if not taxing tips has a different effect on independent restaurants than it does on either chain restaurants or big restaurants or any other part. So if you're sort of looking at your business and you think, oh man, not taxing tips will have this disparate effect on me that it won't have on anyone else, or there's something going on, we do need to know it, right? Because if the debate does get down the road and they start asking, we're going to want to know. And I mean, Chris has never run a restaurant. I've never run a restaurant, right? If there's something out there that you think is unique to independents or smaller restaurants, it would be great to know that going into the debate, just in case it does sneak its way into sort of the final discussions. It's also a nice way to differentiate ourselves. If there is something to differentiate us, there very well may not be. You know, all the lawyers now want to put a tip line on their retainers and their fee agreements so that they don't get taxed on their income either. I'm sure there's going to be a provision that wouldn't let that happen if they move forward. But if there's a real reason not to engage on independence, then I think it's worth putting out there.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Sorry, I'm having another delivery. So finally, after all that, and I'm sure we will have an opportunity as IRC members to submit any sort of input that we have on those issues. But as a final thing, or final-ish, what about business interruption insurance? Patrick, can you walk us through why this remains a priority?
Sure. I'm actually going to go a step further. Insurance seems to be a major issue across the economy right now, which doesn't make the pain of business interruption insurance any less for those who are affected. But I think I've told some of you this before. I represent the Historic Tax Credit Coalition, and they're the coalition that uses the 20% credit to rehab old buildings, historic buildings. And there are some insurers who now won't insure buildings that were built more than 50 years ago, right? Or if you have like a converted jail, there's a converted jail project in Minnesota that got done. The insurance companies are saying you have 25 housing units. Instead of insuring 25 housing units, we're going to insure like the giant limestone rock jail. And you would have to rebuild it as it is. And we're not willing to offer you insurance, or it will cost you 7 times what it cost before, right? And restaurants in Asheville and other places are feeling the pain of business interruption insurance decisions that are not letting them recover for not being able to be in business. And I know there was a big lawsuit about this at the beginning of the pandemic. It's a little less sort of nationwide right now, but it's certainly in those disaster areas, people are really feeling it. So I think there's going to be generally some sort of insurance reckoning in the next 2 to 10 years somehow on either, you know, there are tons of ideas out there, federal backstops and mandatory increase language and all kinds of stuff that could end up happening. I don't know what the answer is. And I frankly don't think there's a policymaker in Washington who could tell you the answer is X. But I think that people are starting to feel the pain. And, you know, this is the kind of issue where talking about it, socializing it, letting members know about it, sort of starts that ball rolling, and being able to tell the story of, oh, my business in Asheville didn't have power for 8 weeks and I couldn't get a business interruption payout. What's the point in having business interruption insurance, right? There's a lot of value in that. And the more stories there are, the closer you get to action. So I think, Chris, you had a meeting on this recently, maybe?
Yeah, in response to, you mentioned those impacted in Asheville, really tragic situations, what's happened in Western North Carolina and other places. But Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina has been taking the lead on a disaster recovery response package from Congress. He's actually testifying right now before the Senate Appropriations Committee on this topic. But we organized a meeting with his staff, who has been putting together the package with a request that they think about ways in which companies that had business interruption insurance denied or claims denied can be made whole as part of their disaster recovery package. So we're anxious to see what they put together. They were sympathetic to our case and cause and request. So even if we're not able to get specific language or legislation included as part of that major funding package that will be moving through Congress at some point here in the near future, they made a commitment to continue that conversation with us about how they can, and they're a very powerful person within the banking sector, and Senator Tillis sits on the banking committee. So it's one where we're going to continue to have a conversation with them about this issue, and hopefully get some resolution to this and some response, because it is just terrible that it's happening.
I'm glad to hear that something's happening about it. I have a lot of friends who are massively impacted. They just got clean water yesterday, and the hurricane happened on September 30th, I believe. So that's a long time. Well, thanks for all of that. Let's shift gears a little right now. Ivy and I have a few questions, and we'll also answer some questions that we received from our members before the call. Patrick, let's start with you. What's the one thing that will change in 2025 that IRC members should prepare for?
I think from a DC perspective, that's really the pace of things, right? Under unified control, things can move pretty fast. And I think we're going to have to be even more nimble than we've been, right? I mean, Chris has given us a great example of the reservation bot answer, right? But at the same time, we may need to be nimble on no tax on tips, or, you know, in the last tax debate, President Trump said that the solution for restaurants was reinstating the deductibility of business meals, right? Like there's going to be, and you know, a Trump presidency has the benefit or the detriment, depending on how you look at it, of new ideas almost every day, right? Sometimes those are frankly great ideas. Sometimes they're not so great ideas, but there's a lot of noise out there, right? And we're going to need to be nimble and ready to react to things that affect us. And I think the other thing we're going to need to be is loud, not like walking in the streets with signs loud, right? But like reaching out to our members and being ready and letting people know what we think when something comes up that's a big deal for us.
Yeah, being engaged is the only power we have, right?
Right.
Well, what's the one thing you expect to remain the same, and how should our members approach that?
I mean, I expect
Chris.
the IRC to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Chris.
sorry, no, yeah, please.
Go ahead, Patrick.
I was going to say I expect the IRC to remain the same, right? Like I expect it to continue to be a voice for independent restaurants that's respected in DC and sort of ready to be nimble and loud when it needs to be.
Yeah, I'll just add, I expect there to be a lot of legislative and regulatory issues that will impact us, from the tax cuts, from all the other aggressive policy issues that will come from this administration, and Congress is in a unique position to want to respond to this administration. I'm expecting a lot of activity in a lot of different areas. Some will impact us, some will not, but from energy to healthcare to financial services to taxation and tariffs and a myriad of other issues. We expect this to be an incredibly busy 2 years. So it's important to stay engaged, as we've been saying all along, and respond. The best part of what we have in front of us is we're not new anymore. We've spent the last number of years building congressional champions. Yeah. And the best time to make friends is when you don't need them, and we've been doing that. So we're going to need them in the next couple of years.
And in the meantime, like what should members of the IRC be doing today, given that things are ending so quickly, to help position ourselves for the industry for success next year?
I think more of the same. Stay engaged, stay involved, join these calls. Let us know what issues are impacting you. We beyond just reaching out to Senator Tillis on the disaster recovery issues in North Carolina. I know there's a number of resources that have been set up in support of businesses, or independent restaurants. So we are extremely strong advocates for independent restaurants, and the work that Erica and the team do at the IRC is more than just responding to congressional or administrative activity. There's a lot of resources at play. So I would encourage you to encourage your peers to get involved. And there's strength in numbers, and as we fight these issues and work to advocate on behalf of independent restaurants, the stronger we appear, the quicker we'll get action.
Let me just add something for the next 40 days. Everybody always wants something from you all, right? A table, a Christmas party, somewhere to go for Thanksgiving. And whether they're your United States Senator, or you're in Ohio and it's the Vice President-elect, or it's your city councilman or your city manager, whoever it is, don't forget them. Like when they ask you for something, do what you need to do for your business. If you give it to them, if you don't, but when they want something from you, make sure you know how to get in touch with them in January when you want something from them, right? I don't know that I've ever put it this way to this group, but you are uniquely situated because, if you make widgets or you're an automaker or whoever, members of Congress don't interact with you in their personal lives the way that everybody, their staff, the members, their spouses, their kids interact with restaurants, right? You are in the community in a way that most other people who want something are not. And you're in the hospitality business, right? So you never want to have someone come in and be like, oh, it's so great to have you. Will you pass this bill? but it's so great to have you, and then call on Tuesday and say, will you pass this bill? That's a way to be both hospitable and to advocate for yourselves, right? So over the next 6 weeks, as everybody asks you for something, keep track, right? Keep a ledger, know who's coming in, and be ready to reach back out.
Yeah, I think on that note, I think it's just important to meet your Congress people when they're in town. When we were originally fighting for trying to get support for restaurants during COVID, I found out when my Congresswoman Yvette Clarke was in town, and I just tracked her down. I was like, "Have you heard of it?" And she was like, "Okay, I'll sign." That's literally how easy it was. I mean, maybe she'd already heard of it, but I gave myself a pat in the back. If you figure out when your people are home and not on the Hill, one face-to-face conversation can make a really big difference. Chris, kind of switching gears a little bit, will the administration revisit tariffs and trade policies that impact the cost of imported food, wine, and other alcohol or equipment? I have vivid memories of tariffs. I just opened up a wine bar. We serve a lot of not domestic wine. What's going on there? How do you foresee that affecting us?
Yeah, this is going to be front and center in a big way next year. And one issue that we really need to focus in on, my concern is that what the administration will try to do is do a blanket tariff on every imported product at a 20% level. The days of picking and choosing which industries are impacted seem to be over. The president-elect was pretty forceful on the campaign trail and what he wants to do in terms of enacting tariffs. So I'm looking at the administration and putting just a tariff on every imported product. Now, the Congress may get engaged and try to limit certain industries, because if you look at the all of this is born out of anti-China focus to try to onshore domestic production of goods and decrease our reliance on China. But what will get caught up in that chop of anti-China tariffs will be other products like goods you don't get from China, wine and spirits from Europe or any other country. So I am fearful that this will be a major across-the-board tariff that gets implemented. And what we're trying to figure out now is what Congress's role will be. We mentioned reconciliation, the reconciliation process that will be used to pass tax reform. When you add tariffs, you, in theory, add revenue to the Treasury, which would potentially pay for some of the tax cuts. So that's going to be a big debate on the Hill, is whether the Congress uses the tariffs as part of reconciliation, or if, like other administrations, they're done by executive order. But yes, tariffs will be a major policy debate over the first 100 days of the administration. So I think that's an issue that will take a lot of our time and attention in the first months of 2025 for sure.
Yeah, that's going to be a big deal for everybody in our industry. Switching gears a little bit, but still kind of on topic for sourcing. Some of our members are really engaged in the Farm Bill, and we saw, Patrick, that Chairwoman Stabenow introduced a Farm Bill proposal this week. What is the likelihood that it will advance, and what happens if it doesn't?
Sure. Debbie Stabenow is the chair of the Senate Ag Committee. She's from Michigan. She has announced her retirement, so she's one of those members leaving on January 3rd, and obviously a Democrat will not be chair of the Agriculture Committee next year in the Senate because a Republican will. And I will just sort of my expert political judgment. This is just too late. They just waited too long to get their priorities out there. I think she wants to try to influence the debate next year. I think within 20 minutes of her putting that bill out there, House leadership said we're going to extend the Farm Bill for a year as is, and we'll deal with it later. So, I think there will be some discussions and there will be some noise. But I think at the end of the year, you'll see a short-term Farm Bill extension and a debate next year on a larger Farm Bill.
Okay, we also see lots of discussion about tax benefits for larger businesses. Do you think we will see changes in our tax policy affecting small businesses, including deductions and credits? Patrick, as our tax expert, could you respond? And then Chris, we'd love to get your input as well.
I mean, I'll just say two things. The two biggest parts of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that expire, the corporate rate is actually permanent. It doesn't expire, so there won't, I mean, they may end up changing the corporate rate, but that's not what's driving this conversation. And one of the things that's been discussed is moving the corporate rate from 21 to 15%, but only if you make your stuff in America. And while sort of a fascinating idea, I'm not really sure how you execute it. So there are really smart people trying to figure that out right now. But the individual rates are what expires at the end of the year. So the tax cuts that were given to people expire and will need to be renewed. Also, there's a small partnership pass-through deduction, that sort of automatic deduction that you get, that expires at the end of next year. So we're definitely going to see tax policies that affect us more than they do McDonald's as part of the debate next year. We'll also see things like the research and development tax credit, potentially the state and local tax deductions, and some of the other things that are out there that will be part of the mix. But this is sort of us that's going to be talked about next year. Small business owners, a sole member LLC, small partnerships, those kind of things more so than 3M or Lindy or Tesla as part of what's going on.
Chris?
I think Patrick covered it. It's going to be, there'll be other proposals that get looked to be added to the tax debate. So along the other list of issues we'll be tracking, that's certainly one we'll look to ensure is covered in the tax reform discussions. But Patrick covered most of the other ones that are important to track.
All righty. So another hot topic on the campaign trail was immigration. While the agricultural and construction sectors obviously rely heavily on migrant labor, hospitality has traditionally been a great place for newcomers to the US to get their start. What changes to immigration policy should we expect? And how will they impact our ability to hire and retain workers? Are we going to have some sort of ICE raid scenarios coming into our kitchens? That's something that I'm particularly worried about. Yeah, how's immigration? How's it going to affect us?
I'll start and let Patrick add in any thoughts he has. Similar to some of the other campaign promises we talked about in the past, this will be front and center for sure with this administration. I think one of the things, as we talk about how we can position ourselves to be a player in those conversations, is to do more to talk about the economics of a restaurant and how we rely on this population to provide the services that we do, and the importance of those individuals to our business. I think that's the best position that an advocacy group like the IRC can bring to this conversation. So that's what we're looking at, is how we can use some of those economic data points to have members of Congress understand more fully the positive impact that this community has on independent restaurants.
And I'll just say, the administration is going to focus on immigration. They have said it. It's clear. It's going to be part of what they do. One of the ideas out there is that they're going to deploy the National Guard, right? That is a state-by-state issue. So, Ivy, it might be a different result for you than it is for Cheetie, than it is for Bob, than it is for whoever else, right? Like, it may not be that Philadelphia looks like Ann Arbor in how this is done. So a lot of that's still unknown, I think, to everybody, including the people who intend on executing whatever plan it is. They still have a lot of work to do on how exactly to do it.
Yeah, I know. I've been worried, and we've been hearing from members who are really concerned about keeping our teams safe with the threat of mass deportations. And while there is not a one-size-fits-all solution, there's a list of resources on the IRC website that we hope you'll find useful. I certainly did. You'll find that on the webpage under the resources tab. And I think Erica might have just put that in the chat or is about to. Okay, so before we wrap up, we want to remind everyone that the IRC is powered by our members. Joining the IRC not only supports the work we've discussed today, but also gives you the opportunity to participate in advocacy events on the Hill and shape the future of our industry. As you've learned, It's going to be a very active couple of years. So yeah, wanted to make sure that y'all stay engaged.
Yeah, you can visit our website, independentrestaurantcoalition.com, to become a member, renew your membership, or contact Andrea if you'd like to gift a membership to a friend or colleague. You can find her information right here in the chat. And don't forget to stay tuned via Instagram and our newsletter for more events, resources, and opportunities to get involved. I think it's pretty obvious that with all this change, now more than ever, we need to really get involved, and I hope you join us in those efforts.
Yeah, and please make sure you check out the chat. There's several links in there and a survey. Stay engaged, stay involved, stay active, and want to say thank you to Patrick and Chris for sharing your expertise as always. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Together, we can make a difference for independent restaurants. We have already and will continue to do so, restaurants and bars all across the country. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.